We'll talk a little bit about like statistics, like what's happening in the world of like, are people knocking on the door and being like, hey, HIPAA audit, we're here.
Well, it happens to me like 5 times a day. It's like those Yelp guys. They're always wanting to, like, they're like, we're auditing you. I'm like, again? No, I'm not even a HIPAA covered entity. No, no, they're not. So like, here's the thing that frustrates me is when I see colleagues in this niche who also try to help people with HIPAA specifically, not just tech. There's lots of people, including you, Joe, who help people with tech, but are trying to help them with the compliance side and security side. They'll mention things like, oh, the 2016 random audits are coming. Are you prepared? And I'm like, I'm prepared by the fact that I'm not going to be randomly audited. I'm not going to be chosen for that because there's only been 2 random audit programs in the history of HIPAA. And both of them did about 150. It's basically 120 and like around 200 each time covered entities, which that includes everything. Oh, and business associates. So even like, companies that serve healthcare, like Office Ally, they were on the list of people who could be audited. I don't know who was audited, but it includes companies like that, as well as actual like healthcare entities. And they don't actually randomly choose them. Yeah. Like that, they say random audits, but it's not fully random. They actually, what's random is who gets the initial survey to ask about your practice. And you could have gotten that. You could have gotten the survey where they just ask you about your practice. But then they actually, based on the surveys, explicitly choose who to audit. And they don't choose individual private practitioners, mental health practitioners. Like that just doesn't meet their, that doesn't serve their goals. Yeah, and I think you touched on something, how some people kind of use that fear of the random audits are coming. And I love that one of your core values is we're not going to use fear to get people to either buy something or opt into an email or whatever it is that you're developing. And as we've had you on the podcast and done these, that like fear isn't the motivating factor. I mean, there's things that you just need to be cognizant of, but it's not, it's going to be, here's what's happening. You need to make the best decision based on this information. I just think that should be a red flag to people. If people are just using fear to get you to opt into something or to buy something, like just ask Roy and say, hey, should I opt into this? And I'll tell you how many times Rob Reinhart and I have gotten like people forward to us emails from various parties being like, I'm scared seeing this. Should I be scared? And we're like, no. No, you should not. So what are the stats? Like, I mean, for the average. Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. I can tell you this, that so for people who are likely on this podcast, the things that are likely to actually get you into like an audit or what's called an investigation is that the most likely thing is that someone files a complaint to the feds about your HIPAA compliance specifically. I don't mean like they file a complaint to your board. Your board isn't going to investigate that. Right. The people who investigate HIPAA is the Federal Office of Civil Rights, which is part of Health and Human Services, or your state attorney general. Those are the people who can enforce HIPAA, or the federal attorney general too, but that's unlikely. So like in that point, the biggest reason people like us ever get into those investigations is when someone complains. And complaining is actually very easy. There's a website where you go fill out a form and you file your complaint, and they always follow up on complaints. The other possible way to get into investigation is if you have a security breach, meaning you accidentally disclose records or you lose records or someone gets access to records or even just emails or any information about a client. You probably or may have to go report that you had a essentially a confidentiality breach, but that's not how they frame it. And then based on that, depending on how many people were impacted and whether you have a pattern of this happening in the past and various other factors, they might investigate you. And they said last year that they're starting to investigate breaches that are smaller than 500 individuals. And so it's possible that if you have what is for us a significant breach, something that impacts like, tens of clients, it's possible they'll follow up on that with an investigation. I have not yet been able to find any data to determine if they are doing so. So they may or may not be doing that. But the big thing you want to be concerned about, as is always the case for us, is complaints. That's where it happens. That's where the hard stuff happens. So like what's an example of complaints for the average either sole practitioner or a group practice? The big thing they do is, so the complaint has to be founded on a HIPAA problem. Like the person has to complain that you're not complying with HIPAA, and they have to show the way in which you're not complying. All right. So usually the biggest way that happens is a person complains about your privacy policies. either you're not following them, or your privacy policy is not actually HIPAA compliant. Like, for example, often what people will go for, if someone has a legit complaint, like they're actually complaining because you've done something they felt harmful, it's usually because you don't release records on time, or you're just really cagey about releasing records. That's the biggest thing that gets mental health folks in trouble. So you got to be ready
the
to do
release
that.
of the records, if someone signed a release that you aren't doing, more than accidentally releasing records.
Oh yeah, that they have asked you for copies of their records and you're not giving them to them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's the big thing. Like if you go to the Wall of Shame, that's they have 2 entries for mental health centers, and they're both related to release of records. You know, one is they were being cagey about releasing. The other was that their policy for releasing was not actually compliant with HIPAA, because HIPAA has rules for some minimums about how you go about releasing records to people who request them. But that's the big one. The other I've seen people complain about is just something about they didn't get a notice of privacy practices timely, or some other thing about privacy practices. And the thing is, the vast majority of complaints are not people who, like clients who legitimately feel like you did something wrong. It's usually clients who don't like you, or more often family of clients who don't like you. Just like licensing board complaints. It's really no different.
Okay. So it sounds like that's pretty low-hanging fruit in regards to having your privacy practices, what they should be. And if someone sends you a release of information for their primary care doctor, like follow obviously best practices and get it out.
Or if they say, I want a verbatim copy of my records to be handed to me, that's the big thing. That's the release. Like, that's a big thing a HIPAA really, really wants to protect for people, is they have a right to get like a verbatim copy of their record from you.
Okay.
Still do the process, still say, wouldn't you rather have a summary, still do all that, because that's good for clients when we do that. But if they want it, you got to hand it over.
Wow. Okay. I think that's something that a lot of people, when they're in that situation, they just don't always know, like, what am I supposed to do in this? And so thanks for clarifying that.